The theme of our Top Leaders Forum for this year, ensuring continuity of private sector engagement for effective risk governance, given new risks due to the pandemic, impacts of climate change, and economic outlook.
Imagine a better, more resilient world where nations can bounce forward from disasters. Critical infrastructures stand firm against calamities, where businesses and communities can thrive. And basic services are uninterrupted, especially when they need them most. This could be our future if we start working together on disaster risk reduction now. The United Nations adopted the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, a bold but brave movement to build resilience in every nation across the globe by minimizing known risks and preventing the creation of new risks. To strengthen pre-disaster risk reduction and pre-disaster preparedness to build capacity among communities towards recovery, and to save lives and protect businesses and investments. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction has 7 global targets. To substantially reduce global disaster mortality and number of people affected globally by 2030. Reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to global gross domestic product and reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. Substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020 and enhance international cooperation to developing countries through adequate and sustainable support to complement their national actions for implementation of the framework, and substantially increase the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to the people by 2030. To help achieve the targets of the Sendai Framework, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction set up Arise Global, an international network of private sector volunteers committing support to the cause. Part of this global network is Arise Philippines. Established in 2015, its membership network of companies and private institutions has grown. Focused on the 4 priorities for action of the Sendai Framework, namely 1. Understanding disaster risk. 2. Strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. 3. Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. And 4. Enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. The members of Arise Philippines continue to work together towards a shared vision of a more resilient Philippines. Through awareness building, mutual cooperation, and action, Arise aims to contribute to building stable businesses, sustainable communities, and safe and resilient Filipino families. Through continuous action and collaboration with the government and the public, this vision can finally become a reality. Helping communities and businesses bounce forward better for a more resilient Philippines. There's still a lot of work to be done. We will live up to our mandate by undertaking activities under our work themes and priority areas. And with your help, we can go further and build better. Be part of the network. Let us co-create a sustainable and resilient future for all of us.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2021 Top Leaders Forum, brought to you by Arise Philippines, SM Prime Holdings Incorporated, and the National Resilience Council. We hope you are well and safe wherever you are right now. There are a number of important topics we need to cover, so let us dive right in. To officially start the forum, please welcome the chairman of the Executive Committee of SM Prime, co-chair of Arise Philippines, and the visionary top leader responsible for setting up this forum 9 years ago, Mr. Hans C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this year's Top Leaders Forum. Thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule to be with us today. I would like to thank very specially all our esteemed speakers for today's forum who will be sharing with us their respective knowledge and insights relative to our theme. Last year, because we had to prioritize managing response actions to the disruption and fear caused by COVID, we were unable to hold this forum. We needed to attend the pressing needs of both our business and communities we serve. We were all faced with unprecedented challenges that needed all hands on deck solution. In the business sector, we mobilized our resources to support the government and the people in confronting what was very unexpected and massive global threat to human life and the economy. These efforts are beginning to let us see some lights now, with evident decline in the numbers of COVID-19 cases, even as the country begins to cautiously open up and try to revert to normalcy in our lives. But we are not yet fully out of the woods though, definitely not. Another COVID strain now even looms over us. We have barely begun to recover from the economic impact of the pandemic. Analysts say that it may take a decade to get back on our pre-pandemic growth trajectory. Meanwhile, as we start to adjust to the new normal under the present scenario, we remain conscious that there are other risks to face as well, particularly crucial of which is climate change, which may lead to other disasters. More frequent and more intense climate events are expected to impact us in the coming years. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are our constant worries too. Not only will these have direct and indirect severe effects on our country's social and economic situation, but this will affect our businesses too, particularly our capacities to sustain our advocacies and effort towards disaster resilience. In today's Top Leaders Forum, we will hear from our distinguished speakers from government, their respective prognosis and projections for the coming year in the context of their plan and directions in DRR and resilience. This we expect to hear given the projected climate change and DRR-driven scenarios taken into consideration the country's economic outlook. We shall likewise hear from our colleagues from the private sector, their rejoinders and inputs to said presentation, and hopefully gain more information to guide us in our future DRR and other resilience effort. The effectiveness of the private sector in its continuing efforts in DRR and resilience understandably depends on its financial capacity. It is then essential that we have a healthy economy in the immediate, medium, and long-term future. The business sector, in turn, need a better appreciation of the future economic outlook in the country. To a certain extent, we hope to be able to achieve a significant part of this appreciation and understanding today. Once again, allow me to thank in advance our distinguished speakers for joining us today to make this forum a truly meaningful undertaking towards better cooperation and results in our common goal of Disaster Resilience Philippines. To all of you, thank you for your participation in this year's forum. We really have to take responsibility and continue to work hard together against the backdrop of this crisis and in the face of other challenges. Hopefully, with this forum, we find more or new approaches and strengthen commitment and action, all towards helping intensify our response to this ongoing pandemic and achieve effective disaster risk governance as a whole. Thank you, and wishing everyone a very Merry Christmas in the coming days.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hansi, Chairman of the Executive Committee of SM Prime, co-chair of Arise Philippines, and the visionary top leader who started the Top Leaders Forum way back in 2012, 9 years ago. So the next person that we will be calling on is another prime mover of Arise Philippines with a stellar career leading disaster resilience efforts across public and private institutions in the country. He leveraged on his wide perspective on disaster risk governance in designing this forum. So top leaders, to tell us more about today's event, please welcome the other co-chair of Arise Philippines, Vice Admiral Alexander Pama.
Thank you very much, Wally. Once again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's Top Leaders Forum. Please indulge me as I briefly introduce to you what this forum is all about and why we are here. Since its inception in 2012, the Top Leaders Forum has been organized and conducted annually and served as a high-level venue for private sector, national and local government units, academe and civil society to come together to share knowledge, experience, and expertise on the disaster risk reduction and resilience in order to help attain the goals of the UN Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in general and push the agenda for the attainment of a disaster resilient Philippines. Last year, we were not able to hold the TLF due to concerns and constraints brought about by the currents of COVID-19 pandemic. While the disaster risk reduction efforts that we were working on in the past had been focused on disasters brought about by natural and human-induced hazards, COVID-19, a biological hazard-induced disaster, happened. As expected, we in the private sector did our share to mitigate the effects of this pandemic to our country and people. And this invariably complicated the disaster risk reduction and resilience efforts in the DRRM paradigm that we were familiar with. The devastation brought about by COVID-19, the continuing exposure and vulnerabilities of many communities and businesses to recurring hazards in the Philippines, the growing impact of climate change crisis, as highlighted in the recently concluded Conference of Parties 26 in Scotland, and also the anticipated results and outcomes of the national and local elections in 2022 may call for a better understanding and a more realistic expectations from government for a candid prognosis of these factors or capacity determinants in order for the private sector to adequately prepare for and forge better collaboration with the government and other stakeholders to ensure the continuity of effective disaster risk governance. The SFDRR recognizes that, and I quote, "The state has the primary role to reduce disaster risk, but that responsibility should be shared with other stakeholders, including local government, the private sector, and other stakeholders," end of quote. In this regard, since the occurrence of disasters severely impact businesses, the private sector has much at stake, but also much to contribute for an effective disaster risk governance. The private sector can leverage on its resources to support government and other sectors to ensure that disaster risk governance will be inclusive, effective, and sustainable. Today, as we reconvene the annual Top Leaders Forum, we intend to reconnect and re-engage with each other and pick up where we left with our DRR advocacies and efforts, where the private sector plays a significant role. We have invited speakers and discussants from our government, the academe, and private sector, as well as some of our international collaborators, to share their insights and perspectives on these burgeoning issues, in particular, the new realities as they impact on the economy. It is therefore our hope that in today's forum, we will learn and benefit from the guidance to be provided by the UNDRR through the UN Secretary General Special Representative, Ms. Mami Mitsutori, the presentations of our speakers from government and the academe, as well as the reactions from our discussants from the private sector representatives. Hopefully, the synthesis of these discussions and inputs from the participants would provide us with a clearer and more profound understanding of what lies ahead. To this end, we will endeavor to achieve the following objectives for this forum. First, to achieve a common understanding of the current and potential risks from the impact of incipient and complex realities brought about by climate change, the new normal resulting from the pandemic, and the projected economic outlook. Second, to develop a deeper appreciation among the participants of the significant individual and collective roles of government and the private sector in ensuring continuity of effective disaster risk governance. And third, hopefully identify gaps and opportunities in policies, plans, programs, and activities for disaster risk reduction and management, and resilience to be able to craft proposals to further strengthen and capacitate the private sector's capabilities to sustain the conduct of doable and sustainable public-private partnership efforts. For now, I invite you to pay close attention to our speakers, their presentations, and hopefully participate in the discussions later in the forum. Thank you again for being with us today, even as we anticipate the participation in discussions or through your written inputs in our chat box. I will see you again later in the program, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Alexander Pama, co-chair of Arise Philippines. Just to emphasize what he mentioned earlier, the private sector has much at stake and can contribute greatly to these efforts. Just to remind everybody, we will be entertaining questions and comments during the open forum later in the program, but please feel free to send your insights and questions via the Zoom chat. Also, for documentation purposes, please fill out the attendance form that the Secretariat has pinned in the chat box. On with our program. We are indeed very happy that our keynote speaker has graciously accepted our invitation to be part of this year's Top Leaders Forum. She served for 27 years in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in various capacities, including Budget Director, Director of the Japan Information and Culture Center at the Embassy of Japan in London, Director of the National Security Policy Division, Director of the United Nations Policy Division, Director of the Status of U.S. Forces Agreement Division, and Deputy Director at the Personnel Division. Having graduated in law from Hitto Tsubatsu University, Tokyo, and obtained a diploma in international studies from the Diplomatic School of Spain, she has taught courses on governance in East Asia at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University and international studies at Waseda University, Tokyo. Prior to joining the UN, she was the executive director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures at the University of East Anglia, UK from 2011. Top leaders, please welcome the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Ms. Mami Mitsutori.
Thank you very much, Wally, for your very kind introduction. Mr. Han Si, co-chair of Arise Philippines, Vice Admiral Alexander Pama, co-chair of Arise Philippines, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this year's Top Leaders Forum. I always look forward to this annual forum and regret that we have not been able to meet in person last year. Having said that, I am encouraged by your resilience in bringing us together virtually against all odds to move forward the disaster risk reduction agenda at this crucial time. Indeed, since the adoption of the Sendai Framework in 2015, we have made great strides in advancing DRR throughout global policies and agendas. Nonetheless, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for important changes. In particular, the pandemic revealed why we need both an all hazards and a whole of society approach to managing risks. It also underscored the need to consider non-traditional hazards such as emerging infectious diseases, as well as hazards that are related to extreme weather events. Moreover, COVID-19 has underlined the crucial importance of good risk governance. The pandemic has affected every sector of our society and every business in some respect. Even many that were prepared and had business continuity plans found their plans to be less affected than anticipated. This indicates that our understanding of risk needs to be improved in order to build our resilience. Most importantly, COVID-19 tested our ability to cooperate, learn, and adapt in the face of deep uncertainties and increasing risks. Fortunately, it also provides an opportunity, as Vice Admiral Hama mentioned to us, to revisit the premises and institutions that underpin our modern world. We know that everything needs and deserves a fresh look, from fundamental aspects of governance to what constitutes sustainable development and what is a healthy relationship with the environment and the planet. And we must have a fresh look at these aspects as climate change is ramping up the intensity and impact of devastating extreme weather events. Each year, for low-income countries, global disasters cost around $520 billion. This is already unsustainable and prompts us to urgently ramp up our efforts to adapt and build resilience because, as Mr. C mentioned, economic stability is paramount for a solid foundation for governance. Achieving resilience goals will require significant financing, as highlighted at COP26. While the developed countries must turn into action their promise of $100 billion annual climate financing and the share between what goes into mitigation and adaptation needs to be 50-50, I would also like to encourage the Filipino private sector to continue supporting resilience building initiatives, in particular with your government, and to support your micro, small, and medium enterprises. We know that support does not always have to be direct cash support. It can be in the form of technical and human resource support as well, which SM Prime is already doing in many ways. I'm encouraged and impressed that climate change has been on the political agenda in the Philippines for many years. Built on this long tradition, your country's intervention at the recent COP26 were well received and appreciate the passionate advocacy on behalf of those suffering. Let me also take this opportunity to commend the Philippines' National DRR Master Plan. This comprehensive strategy clearly identifies the private sector's role, not only in regards to the implementation of the Sendai Framework, but also in terms of monitoring and evaluation. I consider it a best practice in tackling DRR through a whole of society effort. And last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge the great work of Arise Philippines. Arise Philippines has united the business sector in shaping the country's trajectory. You have also established a solid public-private partnership through the National Resilience Council, which encourages the business sector to actively participate in DRR governance arrangements. Arise is now growing globally with so many new networks being established in different regions. But I must say that Arise Philippines is one of the most traditionally strong and leading networks of global Arise. Now, we have just launched the midterm review process of the Sendai Framework, in which member states are strongly encouraged to carry out a robust voluntary national review process on how the Sendai Framework has been implemented in your country. While government will be at the center of this review, it is imperative that all stakeholders, and in particular the private sector of all member states, are deeply involved in this process. The way in which the Sendai Framework has been implemented in the Philippines is a model that needs to be replicated, and I strongly request and hope that the private sector will galvanize around ARISE to be part and parcel of this important midterm review process in the Philippines so that we can reach our goals of the Sendai Framework by the year 2030. I wish you all a successful meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mami Mitsutori, our very good friend all the way from Switzerland. She's joining us this early in the morning from that country, and we're very, very thankful that she's joining us and for your kind words about ARISE Philippines. That was Ms. Mami Mitsutori, Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. Ms. Mitsutori referenced earlier the National Disaster Risk Reduction Plan as best example, and to talk to us about the other programs that's being driven by the Office of the Civil Defense is the representative of Undersecretary Halad, who unfortunately won't be able to join us today. Instead, he sent us his representative to share with us the status of disaster risk governance in the new normal. Our next speaker is a retired Major General and currently the Civil Defense Deputy Administrator for Operations of the Office of Civil Defense in the Philippines. He is a member of the Philippine Military Academy class of 1984. Prior to joining the OCD, our speaker held various positions in the military. He served as Commander of Task Force Davao in 2012, working closely with the local government unit and the local police and maintaining the peace and order and security in the city. Top leaders, please welcome Assistant Secretary Casiano Monilla.
A pleasant afternoon to everyone. On behalf of the Secretary of National Defense, the Chairperson of the National DRRM Council, Secretary Delphine and Lorenzana, and our Administrator, Yusek Ricardo Bihalad, who is the Administrator of OCD and the Executive Director of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. It is my honor to share the Staff Leaders Forum briefing on disaster risk governance in the Philippines, the status and outlook for disaster governance in the new normal. My discussion is outlined as follows. I will present some quick facts and figures, emphasizing our rank in the Climate Risk Index in terms of annual and long-term trends and loss and damages. Likewise, the country's disaster risk governance for resilience, highlighting some of our efforts in support to the implementation of the Sendai Framework and the substantial reduction of losses and damages, and in increasing capacities in terms of policies, systems, innovations, funding, among others. And lastly, I would tackle disaster risk governance in the context of the new normal, taking into account the lessons learned from the pandemic, climate impacts, forthcoming change of leaderships, among others. So without much ado, based on the impacts of extreme weather events and associated socioeconomic data, the Philippines ranked 17 in the world as the most affected of annual averages from 2000 to 2019 based on fatalities and economic losses plus the number of climate events. The Philippines ranked 4th in the world. Shown is the trend of the number of deaths attributed to disasters per 100,000 population based on the data from the Sendai Framework monitoring tool. Among the major disasters recorded from 2005 to 2019, disasters caused by meteorological, geophysical, and climatological hazards posted the highest number of casualties. It is notable that the highest number of deaths was recorded in 2013 at 7,056. In that year, Typhoon Yolanda hit Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao in November, and a 7.2 magnitude earthquake affected Bohol in October. This was followed by 2011, the year when Tropical Storm Sendong hit the country in December. Then a COVID-19 hits, bringing considerable spike in the number of deaths in 2020. In terms of average damages and fatalities, during the 10-year period, the cost of damages incurred due to natural extreme events and disasters amounted to around 500 billion pesos. From 2010 to 2020, these include damages in agriculture, infrastructure, private and communications, among others. In terms of fatalities, out of 85,000 recorded deaths from 2010 to 29 November 2021, more than 68,000 or 81% are attributed to COVID-19 related deaths. Relatedly, considering the socio-economic impacts brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, the COVID-19 health response has the highest budget utilized from the National DRRM Fund for 2020 at 67.5%, followed by financial assistance to local government units at 21.5%, and some infrastructure projects. From the data earlier presented, NDRRMC, together with non-government partners and stakeholders, continuously increase its capacities to increase resilience. The succeeding slides will highlight the plan's innovations, financing strategies, among others, that enable effective disaster risk governance in the country. RA 10121 of the Philippine DRRM Act of 2010 mandates the review and updating of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan. In October 2020, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council approved the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan 2020 to 2030. The plan establishes linkage between disaster risk reduction and management, climate change adaptation, and human security by focusing on climate and disaster risk. It incorporated measures that respond to both climate-induced and man-made disasters and pandemics, particularly considering the country's experience with COVID-19. Resilience dimensions were incorporated to the plan by highlighting how sectors, governments, and other critical stakeholders can step towards enhancing resilience by harmonizing DRRM, climate change, adaptation, human security, and advancing building back better approaches towards sustainable development. In regards to policy and planning, RA 10121 mandates the updating the National DRRM Plan. The NDRRMC adopted this last October 2020. This is the second version of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan since the enactment of Republic Act 10121 into law in 2010. The framework depicts transformation and recalibration that emphasizes a number of things. First, the emphasis on the centrality of risk and focus on all hazards approach. It recognizes that risk is systemic in nature that changes over time with interplay of people's level of capacity and vulnerabilities amidst the changing climate, including extreme and slow onset events and man-made activities. The all hazards concept is referred to by Sendai Framework as the concept to strengthen technical and scientific capacity to capitalize on and consolidate existing knowledge and to develop and apply methodologies and models to assess disaster risk, vulnerabilities, and exposures to all hazards. Second, coherence and mutual reinforcement of strategies among actors and across thematic pillars is emphasized to improve the system and avoid working in silos. The framework recognizes the need to establish credible linkages to enhance coherence and harmonization across goals, systems, plans, and policies to avoid duplication, overlapping of efforts, and wastage of resources. Thus, the thematic pillars are organized and clustered into 3 key result areas. KRA1, disaster risk reduction. KRA2 is preparedness and response. And KRA3 is build back better. Finally, the adoption of the 4 priorities for action of Sendai framework as a strategy towards attainment of our goal of a safer, adaptive, disaster resilient Filipino communities towards sustainable development. The updated NDRRM plan is still anchored in the 4 thematic pillars of the DRRM system. It clearly defines the arrangements and responsibilities among agencies and partner organizations in resilience building. This will guide government agencies in prioritizing and implementing programs and projects. With this updating, we expect a more responsive NDRRM plan 2020 to 2030 that takes into consideration recent trends and innovative practices and approaches in DRRM to address the country's vulnerabilities and risks. This strategic plan has 23 outcomes, 50 outputs, and 206 activities. The objective of the prevention mitigation pillar under the leadership of DOST is to address current and reduce future risks of communities and government through mainstreaming integrated risk management into science, policy, and practice. The preparedness pillar, being led by DILG, sets strategies that aim to establish and strengthen capacities of government, communities, CSOs, and private sector to anticipate, cope, and recover from the adverse impacts of hazards and potential cascading disasters and minimize losses and disruption of daily life. Further, the disaster response and early recovery pillar, with DSWG as the lead, aims to provide risk-based, timely, anticipatory response action to address basic life preservation and immediate needs of communities and government. Also, affected communities, population are able to continue life with dignity and prevent or minimize exacerbation of emergency situations. The 4th pillar under the leadership of NEDA is rehabilitation and recovery. And the goal of this pillar is to speed up recovery from disaster losses through rehabilitation and recovery programs that are aligned to sustainable development and build back better principles. In summary, the National DRRM Plan has 23 outcomes, 50 outputs, and 206 activities that are co-owned and implemented by different government agencies at various levels and non-government partners such as the CSOs, the academe, and the private sector. The outputs and activities in this plan were developed employing participatory governance, making it locally grounded and contextualized, globally aligned, and responsive. One of the important enablers for disaster risk governance is the availability of various financing windows for resilience. RA 10121 mandates that no less than 5% of the estimated revenue from regular sources shall be set aside as the local DRRM fund to support disaster risk management. Of the amount appropriated for local DRRM fund, 70% goes to pre-disaster programs and 30% shall be allocated as quick response fund or standby fund for relief, recovery programs, and activities. In addition, under the General Appropriations Act, National DRRM Fund is allocated to aid relief, and for rehabilitation services to communities affected by human-induced and natural calamities. A total of 20 billion pesos in the RRM fund have been allocated for this year. Another financing window available mandated by RA 10121 is the Quick Response Fund. Among the agencies with dedicated QRF include the Departments of Agriculture, Education, Health, Interior and Local Government, the Office of Civil Defense, the Public Works and Highways, Social Welfare and Development. Moreover, by virtue of Republic Act 10174 of 2012, the People's Survival Fund is established to provide long-stream finance for adaptation projects of local government units and local community organizations aimed at increasing resilience of communities and ecosystems to climate change. The law guarantees annual amount of 1 billion pesos for its implementation. One of the imperatives in risk governance is the ability of the policy decision makers and stakeholders to track the country's progress, contributing to the achievement of substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in life, livelihoods and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. As public accountability is one of the cornerstones of the Sendai framework, the NDRRMC establishes its national loss and damage registry that will provide for systematic valuation, validation, reporting, accounting, and database of losses and damage and the impact of natural hazards, including extreme weather events and sea level rise attributed to climate change. On the other hand, we would also like to see our progress in terms of implementing our program activities vis-a-vis our targets in the National Green Plan. Hence, the NDRRM Council initiated the establishment of the results-based and harmonized monitoring and evaluation system at the national, local level, and to allocate funds for its mainstreaming and implementation at all levels. With technical support from the UNDRR and UNDP, the NDRIM Council is currently developing the RBMS that covers the development of monitoring and evaluation framework plan, the technical need assessment, web-based system, and capacity building program for the intended users. For demonstration purposes, shown is a mock-up dashboard for the MNE system. This RBMS, as well as the NLDR, will feed into the country's reporting to the Sendai framework. Note that the RBMS is still a work in progress, and target completion is mid of next year, 2022. As we endeavor to continuously enhance our data governance and digital readiness for DRR, we are conducting the data governance study and will develop a digital readiness strategy. Data has been crucial in risk-informed planning and decision-making for DRR, and we have seen how data has been central to the COVID-19 response in many countries, demonstrating the power of open data. Information management and sharing, and e-governance. Also, having said this, the NDRRMC, in support from UNDP, is conducting the data governance study and developing the digital readiness strategy. And this will be completed by the second quarter of 2022. This project aims to strengthen mechanisms, policies, and institutional arrangements for promoting interoperability of DRR platforms centered on the preferred platform of government through streamlined processes and informed recommendations for code standardization. It will also provide support to the development of planning, generating tools and national exposure database capture through a human-centric lens, and it aims to broaden stakeholder engagement. That is, government, business, development organizations, NGOs, CSOs, among others, and set up for future collaboration on matters related to digitalization for DRR. In terms of innovations for resilience, the Department of Science and Technology, PHIVOLCS, together with other agencies, developed the Geospatial Information Management and Analysis Project for Hazard and Risk Assessment in the Philippines, or the GeoRisk Philippines. It is envisioned to be the Philippine central source of information for accurate and efficient hazards and risk assessment to help the government increase the nation's resilience. The government agencies are working closely with the OST in geomapping and building data for GeoRisk PH. In our pursuit of capacitating our LGUs and in integrating climate resilience and disaster risk reduction measures in the local dream plans, the OCD, together with the DOST, with support from the World Bank, is providing technical assistance to 100 local government units in updating their local dream plans using the GeoRisk PH to achieve the target by June 2022. And this target ascends in number by year. In terms of guiding our local government units with appropriate preparedness and response action, under the leadership of the DILG, various manuals and protocols for various hazards have been developed, including the interim guide for local chief executives and the local COVID-19 task forces for the management of emerging infectious diseases. Moving forward, as part of the We Recover as One strategies, the NDRIMC will initiate the formulation of the National Preparedness and Response Framework for disease outbreaks and pandemics. Another area in DRRM that remains to be one of the biggest challenges of the government is disaster rehabilitation recovery. Having said this, it is important that structures, policies, systems, and mechanisms for coordination and implementation are developed and put in place to facilitate timely and appropriate action. As major disasters have become more frequent, there was a need to prepare a guide that will serve as a reference by the national and local planners in the formulation of post-disaster rehabilitation recovery programs, including conduct of related activities that will contribute in expediting the planning process. The NDRRMC, in partnership with the World Bank, in implementing the Ready to Build program, which aims to capacitate LGUs in pre-disaster recovery planning. This program enables the LGUs develop their local pre-disaster baseline data for evidence-based disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And this will help expedite the process of validating disaster impacts, among others. Local disaster risk financing strategy that will serve as guide in financing the recovery intervention, and draft local disaster rehabilitation recovery program that can be updated and revised depending on the impact of disasters. In terms of critical infrastructures, the Build program, the administration, infrastructure plans promotes new and better cities that are modern, well-planned, disaster resilient, environment friendly, and sustainable. More roads and bridges that will improve linkages and inter-island connectivity reaching the last mile. More infrastructure projects that will provide efficient and integrated transportation systems, which will narrow the geographical and physical divide and will connect the country and its islands and its people to the rest of the world. Shown are among the major infrastructure projects under the purview of the Department of Public Works and Highways, implemented since 2016, including bridges, roads, railways, airports, evacuation centers, school buildings, among others. As one said by Professor Kimio Takeya of Japan, International Cooperation Agency and a Forum, the Philippines is the champion state, dramatically increasing prevention investment with Build, Build, Build initiative by the presidential leadership. It is worth noting that prior to the pandemic, the country's 2019 spending on infrastructure drastically increased, surpassing the 5% GDP mark, which was twice as much as the country's average total spending for the past 50 years. Moving forward, as risks are becoming systemic and dynamic in nature, there's a need for risk governance to be more solid while being adaptive and collaborative in its imperative to take into account the lessons learned and past experiences, while we remain steadfast in achieving developmental gains from our initiative. Strengthening health resilience becomes a priority for all countries with the experience of COVID-19. For the country, our Department of Health is endeavoring to build health resilience to achieve health development goals. Institutionalizing the Dream Health System is one of the priority agenda in the National Dream Strategy. Scaling up health resilience and prioritizing health in our Dream actions will remain to be a priority strategy in the new normal as we manage COVID-19 towards a healthier, resilient Philippines. Dream Health System is an integrated, multi-sectoral, systems-based process that utilizes policies, plans, programs, and strategies to reduce health risks and to improve preparedness to prevent adverse impacts of hazards to individuals and communities. As such, Dream Health institutionalization in the LGU will require shaping major social, technological, environmental, economic, and political factors, specifically on behavioral change, political will, and health financing, among others. We strategically guide us on this. The enhanced PDI-TRV, or the prevent, detect, isolate, treat, reintegrate, and vaccinate strategy serves as the foundation as provided for the National Action Plan for COVID-19 Phase 4. For sustainability, the PDTRB shall then be integrated in the 4 disaster risk reduction and management pillars as provided for in the National Dream Plan. Collectively, this will allow the attainment of the target under Ambisyon Natin 2040 as provided for in the Philippine Development Plan. This charts our strategic direction, taking into consideration our COVID-19 recovery efforts, resilient building initiatives with the forthcoming change leadership. Being a long-term plan, the interim plan is, as discussed in my previous slide, which outlasts political terms and administrations at the national and sub-national level, needs to be regularly reviewed as regards its relevance and impact on the changing realities locally and globally. The outcomes, outputs, and activities under this plan will be reviewed and assessed in 3 review timelines, with a short-term review from 2020 to 2022. Same timeline for the updating of the Philippine Development Plan with the new set of political administration and leadership. This is also the opportunity to contribute to the midterm review of the SDGs and Sendai framework and timely to integrate the recommendations from the COP26 in Glasgow. Medium-term review from 2023-25. Same midterm review for the next Philippine Development Planning cycle. And best opportunity to assess our COVID-19 recovery. In 2026 to 2030 for the long-term review, which is aligned with NGA, SDGs, and Sendai framework. Recognizing that vulnerability reduction is one of the bedrock strategies of the Philippine Development Plan. This review timeline will help us track our progress in this aspect while providing substantial information to socioeconomic assessment, taking into account commitment to a healthy recovery and building resilience to climate risk. That ends my presentation. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Asek Casiano Monilla from the Office of Civil Defense. Our next speaker is currently the Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Special Projects and the official spokesperson and head of communications at the Department of Finance. As Assistant Secretary, she handles sustainable and climate finance as well as direct disaster risk finance. She also manages special projects such as the Interagency Task Force on Marawi Rehabilitation and the Interagency Task Force on Infectious Diseases. She sits as the Secretary of Finance's alternate in different international platforms. Friends, top leaders, our next special guest, Assistant Secretary Attorney Paula Sharina Alvarez.
Thank you. So Mr. Hans TC and retired Vice Admiral Alexander Pama, co-chairs of Arise Philippines, Ms. Mami Mitsutori, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Honorable Delphine Lorenzana, Chairman of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, Honorable Carl Chua, Director General of the NEDA, Mr. Hans Peter Tupers, Chair of Arise Global, Ms. Antonia Yulo Loizaga, President of the National Resilience Council, and Attorney Alexander B. Cabrera, Vice Chair of Arise Philippines, panel reactors, other stakeholders, and members of the audience. On behalf of Secretary Dominguez and the Department of Finance, a pleasant afternoon and thank you for inviting us in this forum. So, by way of background, the Philippines is situated in the Pacific Typhoon Belt and the Pacific Ring of Fire and is among the most climate vulnerable countries in the region. In fact, according to the World Bank, the Philippines is the world's third most vulnerable country to sea level rise and extreme weather events. Because of this, the country is estimated to incur losses and damages estimated to reach 506.1 billion over a decade, which is equivalent to an annual average of damages amounting to 48.9 billion pesos. So despite contributing only 0.3% to the global GHG emissions, we incur an annual average of damages equivalent to 0.33% of our annual average GDP. This is why the DOF considers disaster risks and climate change as a spectrum. So on the one hand, we need investments in climate change adaptation and mitigation to effectively mitigate disaster risks in the short term and climate-induced hazards in the long term. So therefore, financing for resiliency needs to address both adaptation and mitigation on the one hand and disaster risk finance in the form of our DRFI strategy on the other. So over the next 50 years, the country is projected to have a 40% chance of experiencing a loss exceeding 989 billion pesos and a 20% chance of experiencing a loss amounting to 1.5 trillion pesos. So as for economic losses due to lockdowns and strict impositions of the quarantine, the pandemic has also slowed down the country's economic operations. Thus, aside from the imminent fiscal threats and risks posed by climate change, the country is also mobilizing finance to help arrest the economic impacts brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, in order to contain new infections, the government has imposed restrictions in the form of community quarantines, which hampered mobility within the country and the capacity of business establishments to operate. Because of this, we incurred economic losses amounting to a total of 4.3 trillion in 2020, whereas in the next 10 to 40 years, the Philippines is also projected to incur a cost of 37 trillion pesos. Aside from the projected damages to economic growth, the BSP has also recognized the long-term risks that climate hazards pose not only to businesses and the mobility of our people, but also to loan portfolios and investments. So a recent study from the BSP showed that natural disasters have a negative impact on the banking sector's performance. According to BSP Governor Jokno, extreme weather conditions negatively affect the growth of deposits and loans, loan quality, and profitability. So the findings of the study noted three things. First is that savings and time deposit liabilities dropped while non-performing loans surged following extreme rainfall events in 2014 to 2018. And these occurrences are particularly evident in the regions most vulnerable to extreme rainfall episodes and to branches of universal and commercial banks as well as of rural and cooperative banks. Second is that banks incur direct costs from natural disasters and climate change. When integrated with indirect costs from clients and transaction partners, these costs can seriously affect the operations and health of the financial institutions. Third is that extreme weather episodes affect bank response and performance during or after a shock. So this is because banks have to change their business models and practices to adjust post-disaster. This then takes significant time, effort, and costs as well. So while more study is needed to further gauge the impact of climate and environmental risks on the financial system, the current losses, damages, and other fiscal costs already give a glimpse of how climate change will affect the financial sector in the long run. Our rankings and figures about the country's exposure and vulnerability to climate and other environmental risks are compelling enough to urge the BSP to take proactive steps in managing potential threats linked to climate hazards and financial stability. So thus, the BSP will be issuing more regulations to enable the banking industry to make safe and sound responses to risks arising from the transition to a low-carbon economy. So examples of issuances given by the BSP are their Sustainable Central Banking Program, which demonstrates the BSP's commitment to fostering environmentally responsible and sustainable policies and work practices. So with the sustainable finance frameworks, banks are expected to integrate sustainability principles, including environmental and social risk areas in their corporate governance and risk management frameworks, as well as in their strategic objectives and operations. Also, the BSP has also invested a total of $550 million to the Green Bond Fund of the Bank for International Settlements. And in support of government initiatives and to provide a whole-of-nation approach, our local banks have also done their part in raising sustainability in their portfolios. So there are Philippine banks, which we call the first movers, who made significant contributions to scaling up green and sustainable finance by issuing green, social, and sustainability bonds since 2017. So since 2017, we already have 7 banks that have issued a total of $1.15 billion and 85.4 billion pesos worth of green, social, and sustainability bonds. And during the pandemics, 2 banks have also issued social bonds with an equivalent amount of 29 billion intended to finance eligible MSMEs. So these are just some of the pivotal steps that our finance and banking sectors are undertaking towards a greener and more sustainable financial ecosystem. So as for our capital markets, the Philippine Securities and Exchange Commission has also formally launched the sustainability reporting guidelines for publicly listed companies. And broad principles on sustainability have also been incorporated in the Code of Corporate Governance for publicly listed companies. However, further disclosure of requirements may be introduced in the medium term. So this is still an ongoing effort, since sustainable finance is something that is just emerging as a concept. However, the Philippines is quite ahead. So aside from this, the SEC has also released memorandum circulars providing guidance on the issuance of green bonds, social bonds, and sustainability bonds that are aligned with the ASEAN Green Bond Standards and the ICMA principles. Another example is the Philippine Stock Exchange, or PSE, now requires listed companies to report on the governance aspects of sustainability. And although no requirements yet pertain to the E or S elements of ESG, these are still ongoing efforts on the part of the private and government partnerships towards sustainability. So as for legislation, we also have the Corporate Social Responsibility Act, which aims to make companies accountable for and to disclose their corporate social responsibility related activities. However, now what we are seeing is that corporate social responsibility should not be optional, because again, moving forward, we need to integrate ESG principles in our financing. I would further explain that in the next slide. So last is the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, which also aim to promote environmental change and increase companies' responsibility. So next slide, please. Okay, so how do we aim to address the financial needs of the country in terms of sustainability? So the DOF aims to address climate change by mainstreaming climate and sustainable finance through monetary, fiscal, and public investment management policies. So recognizing that climate change not only affects our regions and rural areas, but most importantly, our financial institutions, investments, and all other areas of our country's economic operations, we are now looking towards finding sustainable means to finance our climate actions and build resiliency down to the local level. So sustainable finance or green finance is defined as a type of financing that takes into consideration the ESG factors or environmental, social, and governance in making investment decisions through financial tools. So sustainable financing is essential to climate action because the ESG in sustainable financing incorporates the risk assessment of long-term environmental, social, and governance challenges and developments. So leading to an increased level of financial flows in the banking, microcredit, and insurance sectors, and longer-term investments into sustainable economic activities and projects. So by integrating ESG factors, we can therefore better plan ahead on how we transition our investments so that we lower the risk exposure of, for example, our portfolios or our insurance products in terms of the risk hazards associated in climate-induced long-term effects. So next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of government initiatives to help address climate change, flashed on your screen is a timeline of the latest government actions. So last July, the Single-Use Plastic Products Regulation Bill was approved on third reading in the House of Representatives, and this aims to urge the Filipino people to do their part on a daily basis in saving the world's environment. So the DOF is pushing for the Single-Use Plastic Productions Bill or House Bill 9147 to help us address our growing plastic pollution problem. So in September, we also started the process of scaling up the country's crop insurance protection to include climate-induced vulnerabilities through the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation. Last October 13, as we mentioned earlier, we also launched the reconstituted National Panel of Technical Experts under the Climate Change Commission. So I'll explain this further later. And on October 20, we also launched the Sustainable Finance Roadmap. And as a highlight of our climate actions for this quarter is the participation of the Secretary of Finance as head of delegation to the COP26 or the Conference of the Parties to the Climate Change UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow from October 31 to November 12. So as a highlight, during COP26, Secretary Dominguez headed the Philippine delegation, which comprised of members from the Department of Finance, Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Energy, and the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So during the high-level event of the Sustainable Finance, next slide, please. During the high-level discussions on finance, Secretary Dominguez emphasized that climate finance should comprise of three things. Number one is grants. And this is to help our people in terms of capacity building to better understand climate change and how we can address them. Second is through investments to help the private sector as well as the local governments fund adaptation and mitigation projects to better address the effects of climate change. And third are subsidies to help our businesses and economic sectors fund the cost of transitioning into a low-carbon economy. Again, Secretary Dominguez emphasized that climate justice should be mainstreamed by helping developing countries fund their transition, adaptation, and mitigation needs. Again, he reiterated that the Philippines only accounts for 0.3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, we bear the brunt of the effects of climate change, as can be seen through our economic damages yearly and the increasing price of insurance premium. So we have been championing this through the UN process. However, we have yet to see how we can actually mobilize finance through the UN structure. That is why Secretary Dominguez has also written our multilateral development partners to enable MDBs like the ADB, the World Bank, the AIIB, and the European Infrastructure Investment Bank to actually help us mobilize financing to address our pressing needs for climate adaptation and mitigation. So next slide, please. Okay, so to show the whole world that the Philippines is serious in addressing climate change, the CCC, through the leadership of Secretary Dominguez, reconstituted the National Panel of Technical Experts to include scientists and experts that represent the different islands and regions of the Philippines, as well as the different fields that are essential in crafting a more holistic national adaptation plan. So, for example, we now have public health experts to provide inputs on how climate change affects emerging diseases, as well as the health of Filipino peoples. So what does the National Panel of Technical Experts do? So under the law, they are mandated to give the CCC sound advice and strategies on how to implement doable climate actions at the local level, which can be replicated across the country. So the new members were specifically chosen for their fields of expertise and years of on-the-ground work experience. And Secretary Dominguez emphasized the importance of having representatives from the different regions of the Philippines in order for the Philippines to better address the impacts of climate change through each local government by capacitating them with their local risks incorporated in the national action plans, so that government could have a better understanding of what needs to be funded and what are the most imminent threats posed by climate change on the ground. So next slide, please. So these are the new fields of expertise covered by our new set of National Panel of Technical Experts. And the goal is to address the different threats posed by climate change through a bottom-up approach. So next slide, please. So the first task asked by Secretary Dominguez from the National Panel of Technical Experts is to draft the top 10 risks that are the long-term climate-induced hazards that we will be facing. So this is also based on the different hazards seen by each of the regions. So these are rising sea levels, coastal erosion, flooding, increasing frequency and severity of tropical typhoons, extreme drought, temperature increase and rising urban heat index, extreme rainfall, climate-induced diseases, wind patterns, and biodiversity loss. So these top risks will be integrated as we update the National Climate Change Action Plan, in which we plan to involve other government agencies such as the Department of Agriculture, the DILG, the DENR, and other agencies, as we are working towards a whole-of-nation approach in combating climate change. And this means that we have to include every sector that is affected, including the business and finance sector. So next slide, please. So aside from this, we also launched the Sustainable Finance Roadmap and its guiding principles through the Interagency Technical Working Group for Sustainable Finance, led by the DOF and the BSP, which was launched in partnership with the British Embassy, Manila, through the Prosperity Fund. So the roadmap and guiding principles mainly focuses on policy and regulatory gaps in promoting sustainable investments through finance, implementing sustainable government initiatives, facilitating investments in public infrastructure, and developing projects that promote sustainable financing in the Philippines. So it also gives us an overview of sustainable finance landscape in the country, so that each investor or each member of the business sector or anyone who is interested in looking at how the different government agencies take into consideration sustainable finance could have a document that would guide them on what this is. So next slide, please. So the Sustainable Finance Roadmap has 3 pillars, and we will be developing first the policy environment, so creating a conducive environment to mobilize financing towards sustainable projects. Second is the financing, so how do we mainstream sustainable finance? And third is the investment pillar, which we would be developing a sustainable pipeline. So next slide. So for the guiding principles, this provides a taxonomy of sorts that will help government agencies with the definitions of what can be considered for financing when we talk about sustainable finance. It also aims to create the environment for greener policies, the mainstreaming of sustainable finance, and a pipeline for investments that will help the country reduce its carbon footprint even as economic output is raised. So the guiding principles include 7 indicators or factors that can help gauge and assess economic activities. So these are climate change mitigation and adaptation, promoting transition to a low carbon economy, resilient food systems, sustainable cities, sustainable and resilient infrastructure for inclusive growth and poverty reduction, environmental management, conservation, and what are prohibited activities that should not be considered. So it also provides examples of economic activities that are considered as sustainable and environmentally friendly, and scenario analysis or key challenges for climate risk assessments, among others. Okay, so those are just some of the important points that we need to move forward in sustainable finance and in climate change. And as we always say, this is not where our climate actions end, but rather these mark the start of our long fight against climate change and its effects. Most importantly, we are not only doing a whole of government approach to climate change, but we must work towards a whole of nation approach where every Filipino fulfills their own roles to create a safer, cleaner, and more prosperous future for all, where no one is left behind. So with that, I end my presentation, and we hope we could be partners for change. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Paula Alvarez of the Department of Finance. At this point, we turn our attention to the economy. Our next speaker has pre-recorded his presentation, but he will be around later on to answer our questions. So here to share the Philippine Post-Pandemic Economic Outlook is a professor of economics and former dean of the School of Social Science at the Ateneo de Manila University. He is currently a senior fellow for Eagle Watch, the macroeconomic forecasting unit of the economics department. Top leaders, Dr. Fernando Aldaba.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Vice Admiral Pama and Mr. Hansi for inviting me to give a talk in this Top Leaders Forum of ARISE. Now let me give you an outline of my presentation. First, I will share with you the current situation of our economy. Where are we now? Then, I look at the risks and prospects of the recovery in 2021 and beyond. I will also try to describe the new normal or the next normal and how we will be able to continue our growth towards sustainable development. So let me now go to the overview of the Philippine economic performance. The PITIC test summarizes the current state of our economy and was first coined by my colleague, Dr. Cielito Habito, former NEDA secretary. PITIC stands for Presyo, Trabajo, at Kita. First, in terms of price inflation, this year, we actually saw an uptick from a low of 2.625% in 2020. It is now projected that inflation will average around 4.5% this year. In fact, the interest rate in October was actually 4.6%, but this was down from 4.8% in September. For jobs, from an unemployment peak of 17.7% in April last year, our recent rate is down to 8.9% in September 2021. However, underemployment has remained in double digits at 4.2%, symbolizing the abundance of low-quality jobs in the economy. And lastly, for incomes as represented by GDP growth rate, we saw 5 quarters straight negative growth, and the economy has actually rebounded in the second and third quarter of this year with 12 and 7.1% growth rates respectively. The third quarter was actually a surprise. it was expected to be only 4 to 5%. But then we got 7% growth. What you see on your screen is a short view of the economy from the first quarter of 2019 to the current third quarter of 2021. This is the long view where you see the two biggest dips. The first one in 1983 during the post-Aquino assassination, and the second one during the COVID-19 pandemic. There are other costs of the pandemic, both economic and non-economic. So first, there's a loss or reduction of incomes by household, especially those who were fired or who were taken out of their jobs. There was also an increase in poverty incidence from 16.7% in 2018 to 21% in 2020. This was estimated by the World Bank, although a similar estimate was done by my colleague in the economics department, Dr. Jeff Tucanes. Then we have health effects, hunger and malnutrition, and the increased vulnerability to diseases, and cases of mental health like depression, where children are the most vulnerable. And then we also have education and learning effects, especially the inequitable access to internet for online learning. Colleagues in the economics department working for FASTER estimated the daily cost of a lockdown, and it ranged from 8.6 billion to 14.6 billion per day, depending on whether it's a GCQ, MECQ, or ECQ. More recently, the NEDA estimated the long-run costs of COVID-19, which included consumption costs, investment costs, and human capital costs. The total is 41 trillion for the next 10 years. Of course, this is the worst-case scenario, and we can mitigate this with a very strong recovery. Despite the high GDP growth rates in the last 2 quarters, it is still projected that our economy will only get back to pre-pandemic levels at the end of 2022 or early 2023. The high growth rates were helped by the very low base rates of last year's GDP. The recovery will be gradual and fragile. What are the prospects for 2021 and beyond? While we learn to live with the virus. What you see on your screen are the forecasts of the IMF and the World Bank. They see global growth in 2021 from 5.6 to 5.9%, but this will slow down to about 4.3 to 4.9% in 2022 because of the possibility of several downside risks. For the Philippines, the estimates for 2021 growth is mostly between 4 to 5%, and this is likely achievable because of the relatively strong growth in the third quarter. For 2022, it is more likely 5.5 to 6%, although the government is more bullish, forecasting a 7 to 9% growth rate. And of course, this growth in 2021 and 22 may also be tempered by several downside risks. First, economic risks, like inflation, which will probably be due to rising global oil prices and broken value chains. Then you also have trade issues with increased protectionism among governments and possible border closures because of pandemic surges. And then you have health risks with the entry of the new variants of COVID-19 like Omicron most recently. And we also have possibly the capacity of our health system lacking to respond to increasing number of cases due to a surge. We might also have political risks like election and post-election disturbances with the heated campaign. And then there could also be forced lockdowns that will limit mobility of our citizens due to a surge again in the coming months. And finally, climate change and disaster risks that we might experience a strong typhoon, hopefully not a big earthquake, and also some flooding and other types of natural disaster. This slide shows the trend for global oil prices, which may likely cause higher inflation in import-dependent countries like the Philippines. The slide shows that we are actually flattening the curve in terms of the number of COVID-19 cases, but our death rate is still relatively high. With the holidays coming and the entry of a deadlier variant, the question is whether we can actually keep this up, whether we can keep the number of cases very low at less than 1,000 per day. In terms of the political arena, it is usually the case that during an election year, GDP growth rate is high because of the increased spending during the campaign and during the election, and positive expectations of the people post-election. However, this time around, we might be uncertain on whether the highly fragmented electorate will quiet down after the results of the elections are seen. Another political risk is the possibility of lockdowns in case of a surge. So far, our Google mobility indicators show that movement in terms of groceries and pharmacies, parks, and retail and recreation have either returned or exceeded pre-pandemic levels. On your screen is the result of the World Risk Report, and it shows that the Philippines is number 8 among 181 countries ranked by this report. We fared very badly in coping capacities, as you see on your screen, the yellow box. Our risk index in terms of coping capacities is 82.14 out of a possible 100. We want to strengthen our coping capacity. We must first improve disaster risk response management, especially at the local level, at the LGU levels. We should also have a working universal healthcare system, and we should establish an adaptive social protection system. Social protection that is ingrained with climate change adaptation and disaster risk response. We also should have better governance that would curb corruption in the social sectors where the poor are actually mostly harmed because of the leakages due to corruption. And finally, we should have higher trust and a stronger social capital. So what will the new normal look like? And I'll share with you some glimpses. First, revenge demand. This is when the consumers release pent-up demand for selected goods and services, especially services which was mostly hit during the pandemic. For example, dining out or traveling to domestic destinations. Next, increased digitalization and shifts in consumer behavior. The pandemic has accelerated online shopping, and this still has a lot of room for expansion. Digital retail will be a permanent fixture in the new normal, but some customers will really get accustomed to that behavior. Next, changes in the world of work. Before the COVID-19 crisis, working from home was already an option to ease traffic in NCR, but it really just remained a proposal. The pandemic changed all that, with millions of people transitioning immediately to remote work in a wide range of economic sectors. Next, rebalancing and shifts of global supply chains. In the past, supply chains were largely focused on cost efficiency. In the post-COVID-19 world, governments and companies will lend more weight to a resilient and reliable supply of strategic products than before. Supply chains will be reviewed, production will become more diversified and more local. So there might be a lot of reshoring. And companies might stock up more inventories. Next, going green for environmental sustainability. All over the world, the cost of pollution and the benefits of environmental sustainability are increasingly recognized, like in the COP26. Innovations in a wide array of green technologies such as batteries, carbon capture methods, and electric vehicles will further increase in the new normal. Thus, businesses need to respond to the sustainability bias of investors. Next, states and governments will be bigger. And in a crisis situation, there is a need to support innovation. And this will push the state to become entrepreneurial and to lead the private sector in starting relatively higher risk investments. The need for more resources by the government to respond to the pandemic and during the transition to the new normal may also result to higher debt burdens in a post-COVID-19 world. And that includes the Philippine government. And lastly, the exacerbation of inequality. Access to digital technologies is skewed towards richer families, which impacts on the education of poor students. High cost of health services during the pandemic has also disadvantaged the lower income classes who are dependent on insufficient subsidies from the national health insurance. So in the Philippines, the use of digital payments actually accelerated during this pandemic. And it is projected in 2025 that this will reach $28 billion. It's almost equal to the remittances from our OFWs. The sectors on your screen are predicted to thrive in the new normal. Of course, these sectors need to be innovative and adopt new technologies to really expand their markets. This slide, I'd like to share with you a framework that shows the determinants and key actors of economic growth and sustainable development. And this includes human capital, physical capital, social capital, and technology and innovation. These are the factors that will really determine how strong our growth and how we will be able to have sustainable development. So human capital includes a highly trained, well-educated, environment-conscious workforce necessary for sustainable development. Physical capital, meanwhile, includes environment-friendly machinery, buildings, office or warehouse supplies, equipment, and computers that firms and companies own. Social capital consists of the shared values, norms, trusts, and belonging that create social and environmental harmony. And lastly, technology and innovation, all those that increase productivity and promote resiliency and sustainability through newly created methodologies and technologies. This is my last slide. Just a quick look at an agenda for the next normal. So using the framework, first about governance and social capital. The new leader must be able to unite and heal the fragmented population after the elections. Also, the new leader must be able to curb corruption, especially in the social sectors. And finally, the leader should also be able to strengthen local governance in climate change and disaster response. In terms of human capital, we must be the new administration must be able to strengthen the healthcare system to be responsive to any kind of health crisis like the pandemic. Should also prepare for a blended and hybrid type of education, and also to build a proactive and adaptive social protection system that will be reliable during, before and during crisis situations. And for physical capital, we have to modernize and boost agriculture for food sufficiency. They should adopt new technologies in agriculture. They have to promote manufacturing through a sound industrial policy that is both inclusive and sustainable. And we have to revive travel by domestic ecotourism, and also advance renewable energy sources and increase the share of such renewable energy sources in our energy, in our total energy use. And lastly, for technology and innovation, they have to accelerate in the adoption of Industry 4.0 and digitization, but of course with consideration to resiliency and sustainability. So thank you very much.
Dr. Fernando Aldaba, Professor of Economics and former Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the Ateneo de Manila University. We have one last speaker before we bring in our reactors from the private sector. And this gentleman has been very actively supporting Arise Philippines in our endeavors the past couple of months. He holds responsibility for the international humanitarian programs of the UPS Foundation, and he works in parallel with the other partners of the foundation in Europe and Asia to deliver services in the humanitarian situations. Together with the UNHCR, UNICEF, the World Food Program, UN OCHA, the UNDRR, the IFRC, and regional partners such as the BITC and the PDRF, the foundation helps provide various resources and charitable donations for projects in various focus areas. Prior to his current responsibilities on the humanitarian front, he held various management positions with UPS Europe, including border policy management, public affairs, labor relations, and human resources, covering more than 30 years of active service to UPS. Top leaders, please welcome Mr. Hans-Peter Toffers, co-chair of Arise Global.
Many thanks, Alice, for the kind introduction. And I can assure you the introductory picture, even though look a bit different than you see me right now, I'm the same person. I'm just looking a bit different though, with my 30 years of experience plus. So let me share a few slides with you, if I may. And I'm very much honored, let me start with that one, that I'm able to speak in front of this group of dignitaries and important business leaders, again in the Philippines, after participating in your successful International DDR Day celebration only some weeks ago, where I met some of you already. I understand this forum as well as an opportunity to offer guidance to all stakeholders, public and private sector, on how to ensure continuity in disaster risk governance with the sector. Now, in business life, as said, I'm the international director of the UPS Foundation, the charitable arm of UPS, the Logistics Corporation. And in this role, I'm helping to contribute to ESG that has been covered already widely by Assistant Secretary Alvarez. Now, the goals, the ESG goals, which the corporation and the UPS Foundation has commonly laid out and strive to execute in the years to come, are displayed on that slide. And I want to briefly provide this example to show how a corporation defines responsibility as an enterprise, besides serving customers successfully. I want to be brief, but I have to mention that to really understand sustainability, it is important to go beyond environment but include also challenges affecting society and how companies govern themselves to keep their people and our planet healthy, strong, and resilient. UPS, for instance, has invested in driving down carbon consumption, which, as you can appreciate, is hard for a company like UPS, with drivers drive over 2 billion miles a year, hundreds of aircraft flying every day. But UPS is investing in carbon neutral ventures and recently laid out environmental goals that included setting a target of 50% reduction in CO2 per package delivered for global small package by 2035. To achieve a higher level of social sustainability, UPSers are planting trees and ensuring equitable access to vaccines, especially for low and middle income countries. And governance, of course, is how UPS is held responsible for managing its business ethically and advancing environmental and social initiatives. Contributions like these require stable investment climates, open trade lanes, and robust infrastructures, preconditions, I guess, all economic actors have in common and are looking for. The displayed goals are part of UPS's ESG reporting, which in most of the countries is based on voluntary standards and agreements. But we are getting closer to commonly accepted global standards with ESG disclosure, going to create additional layers of complexity for enterprises in all markets around the globe. This means as well, as an enterprise, you probably need even more clarity, planning security, and supporting conditions to positively contribute to common societal goals and broader commitments such as the 2030 SDGs. Now, ESG is about to establish global standards and SDGs ask for voluntary commitments. And I guess midterm review processes that are already initiated, as Mami Mitsutori laid out, will ask all stakeholders to resume their responsibilities. What are these? Basically, risk governance refers to the institutions, rules, conventions, processes, and mechanisms by which decisions about risks are taken and implemented. Let's have a look on good governance. And I took OECD's recommendation, where the main purpose of OECD's is not humanitarian. OECD proposes a fundamental shift in risk governance towards a whole of society effort, if not already done so. It proposes actions that governments can take at all levels of government in collaboration with the private sector and with each other to better assess, prevent, respond to, and recover from the effects of extreme events, as well as take measures to build resilience to rebound from unanticipated events. So what can governments and policymakers do to promote inclusiveness in risk governance? This is what OECD says. Frame national policies for all hazards risk management, engage the private sector in partnerships, and raise awareness of risks to increase stakeholder engagement in policy processes. Taking the activities in the Philippines into account, where the country practiced disaster preparedness and response in the 70s, disaster management in the 80s, disaster risk management in the 90s, and eventually disaster risk reduction in the years 2005 and beyond, I would state that stakeholders in this country are well aware of risks and benefits of collaboration on the other hand. I don't want to spend too much time on the post-pandemic new normal and climate change, as both topics have been covered very good and are probably the most discussed ones in conversations around the globe. But allow me 2 remarks. First of all, any conversation about the post-pandemic new normal is biased by the attitude towards the virus. Is it going away, or are we living with it for all times? How many variants are coming? I guess we will have to accept, like security was added as an additional important layer to societal processes after 9/11, that health protection will dominate our life and related processes for the next decade. It will impact how we live, do business, and communicate, and it will shake economies even more. Question is whether a society is well prepared for this and what is needed. What we learned in the past 2 years is that distance is key, quality of agile healthcare systems is imperative, and status of digitalization defines future success, thus meaning that the quality of infrastructures will play an eminent role in the future. But even if the virus is going away, there will be A fundamental change on how we work and live in future after climate change-induced shocks needs more than attention. And this is what citizens, our customers, are increasingly demanding as they feel that quality of life is changing. They ask for solutions from all stakeholders, causing impact on products, services, and the way we do business. But I don't want to state the obvious. Philippines is well aware of disasters more than many other states. But what might be relevant, huge transformation processes need to be planned, discussed, executed in a reasonable time frame. There are related 2030 goals and beyond set by government leaders, and to achieve them needs common efforts. To discuss contribution needs preparation. This is a multi-annual or even decade approach that needs a stable political framework and a common vision. Now, let me go to my last slide here. What is the role the private sector needs and wants to play? Well, the private sector in many states is very active to bundle resources and work on transformation processes into the new normal and prepare for climate change. This is active DRR and not next year's business in many cases, but has a multi-annual perspective, and it can play well in case of good coordination and early inclusion. Arise Philippines has created a leading example in this regard in the past. Arise, as the leading private sector companies network, committed to risk-informed development, disaster risk reduction, and preparedness action, helps businesses to achieve DRR goals voluntarily. We have outlined imperatives that are relevant to support activities to other stakeholders in society, and we develop focus areas and related concrete KPIs that should support the transformation process towards risk-informed investment. Arise members committed to raise awareness with respect to disaster risk and mobilization of the private sector, influence in respective spheres of expertise, share knowledge and experience and good practices amongst the private sector, catalyze to generate innovation and collaboration in developing risk-informed business strategies, and implement projects and activities to achieve the targets of the Sendai framework. Concrete work in all 29 networks around the globe and growing, and of course, as well in Arise Philippines, which is the gold standard for active networks, is related to 4 key focus areas. Work with SMEs to get DRR incorporated into business action, work with the investors community and investors to increasingly include risk considerations into investment decisions, work with the insurance industry to get them engaged into prevention of risks, work with the government, the regions, the communities to ensure infrastructure is more resilient. This is not about brick and mortar only, but includes relevant infrastructure such as communication, supply chains, healthcare, and others. All activities should lead to a higher level of risk information and will support societal well-being. Allow me a short conclusion. There's more to do and more stakeholders need to be engaged. This is on the side of business. The call has not reached all yet, but business should be included as early as possible, as the approach on transformation, which will inevitably be the task of the century, needs clear guidance and a legislative framework that honors investments into society. We have achieved a lot, but there's no time to rest yet, as new challenges are out there. In any event, keep the good work in the Philippines going. This is a track to success. I guess political stakeholders are not only well aware of the value of private sector's voluntary Arise engagement, but look forward to an even closer collaboration in future. Thanks for listening and happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hans-Peter Toffers, co-chair of Arise Global and a very good partner of Arise Philippines. At this point, we are going to be hearing from our distinguished panel of reactors, but in the interest of time, I have asked our secretariat to include their impressive description in our chat, so we don't eat up too much time running through their impressive resume. So our first reactor is coming from the Management Association of the Philippines. So speaking on behalf of the MAP is their president for 2022, Mr. Alfredo Pascual.
Distinguished speakers and esteemed participants, good afternoon. ASEC Casiano Monilla has given us an overview of disaster risk governance in the Philippines. It is comforting to note that our government has the frameworks, plans, strategies, guidelines, and funding resources for the purpose. The government has certain means to reduce risk, respond to disasters, mitigate the damage, and pursue recovery. I am confident that these programs have been formulated by experts or with expert support. Of course, we realize that there are still initiatives in the completion process. Indeed, the Philippines is among the most hazardous countries in the world. But hazards, as and when they occur, will become disasters if we cannot cope with them. So preparedness is critical, and the government has a vital role to this effort, or in this effort, but so does the private sector. Let me talk about the importance of the private sector in disaster risk management. A greater understanding of the tremendous financial implications of calamities has heightened concern about businesses and the concern by businesses as well. As we continue to encounter more and more worse disasters, most experts predict that these costs to business and, of course, the economy will continue to climb rapidly. The private sector now responds more to calamities. And why not? Electricity, telecommunications, and transportation companies in the Philippines are all owned and operated by private corporations. In the event of a disaster, the ability of firm employees to restore services quickly is critical. With so much private sector involvement, disaster managers face an even more significant problem coordinating response actions. So before a crisis strikes, all levels of government must reach out to businesses and incorporate the needs and possible contributions of businesses in broader preparedness activities. ARISE has already been explained by our esteemed earlier speakers, I believe can facilitate the coordination between government and business. In a disaster, many businesses may be forced to close. Recovery involves people, families, community groups, and government agencies. And business companies must be included in the list. While private businesses have a number of priorities, I hope that with the disastrous experience with the COVID-19 pandemic, managing disasters will now be at the top of businesses' priority list. Business managers and executives must recognize that surviving disturbances and disasters are a central component of having, in the long run, a successful and profitable business. Making disaster awareness and resiliency is part of the organizational culture that creates an important step for a successful business to survive a disaster. The private sector's most significant contribution to economic resilience has been the establishment of a business continuity plan or a business continuity management system. A business continuity management system, as you all know, is an endeavor that seeks to establish business continuity by doing whatever it deems necessary to protect a company's production, information, equipment, and workers. Risk reduction and emergency preparedness measures are extremely cost-effective and considerably lessen the impact of natural disasters on businesses. As part of overall better risk governance, the private sector should work on resilience promoting business practices. Disaster preventive investments of businesses in risk reduction and emergency preparedness can be supported by the green finance vehicles presented to us by ASEC Paula Alvarez. In business contingency planning, the VISTA goes beyond the boundaries of an individual business enterprise. As an actor in implementing disaster management plans, a company needs to coordinate and achieve collaboration with its supply chain, among others. Large-scale disasters can disrupt external sources or resources and common infrastructure facilities, which are essential for business continuity of a number of enterprises in a given location. Thus, the private sector as a group of enterprises should also encourage public sector to strengthen the resilience of the group. The concerned private enterprises should create a coordination framework with the public sector, including local and national governments, to secure the local economy and eventually the national economy in a widespread disaster, like COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, losses as a result of disasters have extensive economic impacts to the national economy. Loss of employment can also have irreversible social impacts. The private sector can play a significant role in promoting the resilient continuation of business and early regeneration of industry in disaster-affected areas. Historically, the poor suffer terribly in disasters, as we have seen in the pandemic. Thus, some firms' business continuity management plans have incorporated principles of corporate social responsibility in disaster scenarios, such as measures for assisting affected people, especially the poor, who are in the community. This is something that the Management Association of the Philippines, or MAP, would like to encourage, given our social justice commitment as embodied in the Covenant for Shared Prosperity that 26 business organizations signed in November last year. This covenant signing was led, of course, by MAP. The concept of an area business contingency management system must be pursued. And I think it's going on now in certain areas in the Philippines, particularly in clusters of companies such as those in industrial parks and export processing zones. Such broader contingency planning will necessarily involve public-private partnership. Area-wide resiliency is an important consideration not only to industry agglomeration, but also to urbanization. Private and public cooperation must be expanded through the new opportunities, given the coordinated risk management to encourage sustainable urban development, as well as the critical economic growth of each locality. A disaster risk reduction and management framework that promotes economic resilience requires area-wide disaster management with significant engagement from both the private sector and the public sector. This strategy of area-wide disaster management will aid in the continuation of businesses in the aftermath of disasters, as well as in the early regeneration of local industry. It should include all stakeholders working together to evaluate risks, develop plans, implement measures, and improve the cyclical process of area-wide disaster risk reduction and management. Such a disaster risk management coordination framework will help assure the continuity of enterprises in a disaster-affected area and help build a resilient society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fred Pascual of the Management Association of the Philippines. Again, ladies and gentlemen, we are directing your attention to the chat for the profile of our speakers and reactors. Our next reactor will be coming from the employers section. So to represent the Employers Confederation of the Philippines, please welcome one of its governor, Mr. Arturo C. Guerrero III.
Mr. Hans C., co-chair of Arise Philippines, retired Admiral Alexander Pama, co-chair of Arise, Ms. Mami Mizutori, special representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Yusek Ricardo Halad, Administrator, Office of Civil Defense, ASEC Paulo Alvarez, Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Special Projects, Dr. Fernando Aldaba, Professor of Economics, School of Social Sciences, Ateneo de Manila, Mr. Hans-Peter Toffers, Co-Chair Arise Global, Mr. Alfredo E. Pascual, President of MAP, Ms. Bing Limhoco, Chairman of the PCCI, Ms. Antonia Yulo Loizaga, President of the National Resilience Council, and Attorney Alexander Cabrera, Vice Chair of Arise Philippines. A pleasant good afternoon to all. I am Butch Guerrero, Governor of the Employers Confederation of the Philippines, and it is my pleasure to provide you with the employer's perspective and reaction on the presentations by the distinguished resource speakers this afternoon. For starters, I would like to commend the previous presentations as they gave us a very good overview of the economy, especially the presentation of Dr. Aldaba. Our disaster risk governance and ways forwards in the new normal. To add to my knowledge, I would like to cite that the risk mentioned earlier, especially disaster risks and the global COVID-19 pandemic, continuously affect 99.51% of the micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises in our country, which employ 62.66% of the labor force according to the 2020 list of establishments of the Philippine Statistics Authority, or we shortly called PSA. The changes in the world of work have sped up with the onslaught of the pandemic last year. Enterprises were forced to digitalize, and almost all their functions to keep their businesses afloat. Now, working from home is a norm, and reporting to the office is only an option for jobs and functions that can be done purely online. Pre-pandemic, the discussion in telecommuting only revolved on where the employees work. Now, flexible working arrangements also involve what time you work and how you do your work. As the economy tries to reopen and recover from the adverse effects of the pandemic, planning employment recovery is essential to achieve inclusive growth and sustainable economic and social development. It is also imperative that we prepare the labor force coming from a high of 17% unemployment rate in skilling, reskilling, and upskilling so that they may be able to adapt to the ever-changing dynamics in the world of work, as previously mentioned by our speakers. While disaster risk reduction is important in combating the effects of climate change in our country, reintroducing the green shift in the Philippines now is also highly recommended, and the government's role in this is very important. The finalization of the National Green Jobs Human Resource Development Plan and the Green Jobs Assessment and Certification System and Guidelines as mandated by the 2016 Green Jobs Act should be prioritized. And the Green Agenda should also be mainstreamed across all levels of education, including TVET, to anticipate the demand from green skills in the future. However, challenges in the green shift are encountered from even before, including the capacity of MSMEs to transitions, like to obtain technology and expertise, and to establish and sustain green programs. There are, of course, cost considerations. Lack of labor market information on green jobs, green industries, green skills, and the like, and the lack of buy-in among employers in terms of value added for their companies. As for ECOP, for the Employers Confederation of the Philippines, we are continuously partnering with institutions and international organizations to offer a wide range of services for our member companies and their employees. Currently, our training offerings not only include human resource and industrial relation courses to aid employers in complying with general labor standards and occupational safety and health, especially in this COVID pandemic, but also include entrepreneurship, mental health in the workplace, soft skills development, and business continuity planning, among others. May I add resiliency, which has been mentioned several times in the presentations of our esteemed presenters. To end, I would like to reiterate that the Employers Confederation of the Philippines recognizes and subscribes to the principle that everyone has a role to play in building a resilient Philippines. And we will continuously be cooperative and collaborative with government and stakeholders to reduce disaster risks, prevent the creation of new risks in order to ensure the resilience of our communities in general and the business in particular, and transition to the new normal. Hopefully, with political stability after 2022, we will be on our way to a resilient Philippines, to green jobs. Maraming salamat po. Stay safe, everyone, and God bless all of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butch Guerrero, Governor of the Employers Confederation of the Philippines. Finally, our last reactor is one of the icons of the franchising sector. Again, I direct your attention to the chat to read more about her profile. Friends, please welcome the chairman of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Ms. Maria Alegria S. Limhoco.
To Mr. Hans C., the ARISE Chair, Vice Admiral Alexander Pama, the co-chair, and to all the dignitaries present here today, to my fellow reactors, guests, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good afternoon to you all. First, I would like to thank ARISE for inviting PCCI to participate in today's private support in effective disaster risk governance in the context of the Philippine economic outlook. Definitely, all the previous speakers have really explained so much. So anyway, let me go to the PCCI initiatives towards economic recovery. To help restart economic activities and restore business and consumer confidence, I would like to share that PCCI has committed to work on helping harmonize the strategies, programs, and policies within the framework of the National Employment Recovery Strategy, or NERS, through actions that will create a policy environment that encourages the generation of more employment opportunities. Aside from vocally advocating for the reopening of the economy, PCCI has maximized its partnership with various stakeholders to help restart economic activities in the country. We have partnered with Small Business Corporation in the implementation of CARES program to support the financial requirements of our MSMEs. We have likewise partnered with Lazada Philippines and Ziyad Limited to onboard and transition our members into the digital space, allowing them to reach out to a wider market. On restoring business and consumer confidence, PCCI has initiated many webinars which serve as venues to inform our members on current policies and programs of the government. These include the conduct of 5 area business conferences where we discuss the most pressing issues and recommended solutions on the most pressing concerns of our members from North Luzon, South Luzon, NCR, Visayas, Mindanao. We also recently conducted the 47th Philippine Business Conference and Expo, where we highlighted the importance of innovation through technology and to demonstrate how pandemic challenges could be transformed into opportunities to realize the vision of Ambition 2040. And as you know, PCCI has been designated as ARTA champions, and as such, we have been conducting a number of dialogues to ensure ease of doing business in the country, particularly during this pandemic. PCCI has likewise been implementing initiatives to upgrade, retool the workforce through our PCCI Innovation Center. We have conducted a series of cloud app development, AI training, in order to prepare our workers and the youth to be the leaders in technology and promote the use of technology to sustain business. PCCI, together with the Employers Confederation of the Philippines, Philippine Exporters Confederation, and other organizations have initiated the Reform, Rebound, Recover, 1 million jobs for 2021 project. This project aims to immediately source Filipino talents for deployment in the construction, manufacturing, particularly semiconductors and electronics, tourism, and hospitality export industries under a policy environment that would help create jobs all over the country. Now let me go to the PCCI initiatives on disaster risk management and climate change and sustainable development. Professor Aldaba mentioned in his presentation that the Philippines ranked 8 out of 181 in the World Disaster Risk Index for 2021, where we failed very badly in coping capacities. He pointed out the need to have an improved disaster risk reduction management, especially at the local level. The work in the disaster risk recovery management is so huge that it cannot only be left alone to the government. It really must be a partnership, and so we are truly glad that the government recognized the private sector as a potent force in bringing our country several notches higher in DRRM by international standards. Since 2016, PCCI has been working with the government, primarily with the Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of Science and Technology, the Office of Civil Defense, and the private sector such as the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, PDRF, and the Philippine Exporters Confederation, PhilExport, Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management Philippines, the Employers Cooperative of the Philippines, and the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center in providing resources, continuity, awareness, and capability building, knowledge and expertise sharing, and shareholder engagement in promoting business continuity management. The SME Disaster Resilience Core Group has formulated a national roadmap for strengthening SME resilience in the In the roadmap, four themes were identified. First is enhancing MSME general and disaster risk data. The second is DRRM and BCM awareness and training. Third is tailored risk financing for SME, MSME, and the MSME inclusion in the DRRM and climate change adaptation policy, planning, and local institutions. Since the signing of the partnership agreement in 2016, the SME Disaster Resilience Core Group has organized 4 National SME and Disaster Resilience Forum and 13 Regional Disaster Resilience Forum and 6 provincial forums were rolled out. We rolled out the roadmap during the pandemic. The SME Disaster Resilience Core Group has likewise conducted 2 disaster resilience fora and 8 episodes of a Resilience Recovery PH, an e-fora series. It also produced the MSME Guide, MSME Guide to Disaster Resilience, which was distributed to all negosyo centers and local chamber of commerce and has successfully advocated the adoption of the MSMEDC Resolution Number 1, Series of 2020, directing all negosyo centers to promote and advocate financial literacy, climate and disaster risk insurance, to ensure disaster resilience and business continuity among micro, small, and medium enterprises in the Philippines. However, we believe that we can do more to help encourage micro, small, and medium enterprises to disaster resiliency. Some of our recommendations include the following: tax credits, deductions, and exemptions for SMEs with business continuity plans. Increase the adoption of institutional regulatory support, ordinances at the local government unit level to provide fiscal and non-fiscal incentives to encourage a greater number of micro, small, and medium enterprises to voluntarily accomplish the business continuity roadmap for their businesses. We also recommend subsidies, grants, and soft loans for the preparation of the business continuity plan. Technical assistance, consultancy service, or training in BCP preparation and disaster preparedness. Develop incentives for LGUs through the Anti-Red Tape Authority and the Department of Interior and Local Government's Seal of Good Local Government to promote increased voluntary accomplishment of the business continuity roadmap by the micro, small, and medium enterprises in their respective jurisdiction. Our SMEs are telling us what they need, what we have, so that we can get a good number of SMEs crossing the line of risk vulnerability to risk resiliency. Our SMEs are the backbone of the economy, and lowering their risk is increasing the assurance that despite natural hazards, our economic activities will keep on moving because we are prepared and we have good safeguards. PCCI has an environment and climate change committee dedicated to promoting environmental sustainability among our members and the business community in general. Through the committees, we have been conducting seminars and fora to enable our members to have a better understanding of climate change. PCCI has likewise endorsed the adoption of the Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCS, where the country commits to a projected GHG emission reduction and avoidance of 75%, of which 2.71 is unconditional and 72.27 is conditional. The country is seen to gain from this commitment by strengthening the resilience and adaptive capacity of the country through enhanced access to finance, technology development, and transfer and capacity building, especially in the implementation of the policies and measures on an uptake of circular economy and sustainable consumption and production practices. The government plays a critical role in achieving the targets, but the important role of the private sector in the NDC implementation can also not be overemphasized. The private sector serves as a catalyst for business to shift into green climate-friendly investment portfolios. It also has a stake in the provision of data needed for climate change monitoring. We also welcome the recent move of the Climate Change Commission to establish the Climate Change Investment Network, as this undertaking is an opportunity to also centralize the agency and climate finance, such as the Green Climate Fund, GCF, Global Environment Facility, GEF, and bilateral funding such as Joint Crediting Mechanism, or JCM, of Japan, and multilateral funds such as Asian Development Bank. In terms of sustainable development, PCCI has a commitment to promote the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our PCCI SDG Committee has collaborated with UP Cephal, Philippines, to provide a capacity building program to help the business sector in adopting the SDGs in their business operations. Further, the PCCI SDG Committee has been in close coordination and partnership with the United Nations Development Program and the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation and the National Development Authority and the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority in furthering our engagement with various stakeholders to ensure that our members are aligned with the commitment to the global goals, leaving no one behind by 2030. We did this not only by bringing the SDGs to the fore of business operations, but also by undertaking specific health and upskilling interventions for displaced workers as we continue to work with other multilateral agencies in support of the localization of the SDGs, with the recent signing of support for the Integrated National Financing Framework for the SDGs in the Philippines, together with the World Bank, UNICEF, and the Philippine government. Now, moving forward, we prepare with the change of administration next year. PCCI has crafted a set of resolutions to address the short, medium, and long-term policy and program direction towards full economic recovery. During our 47th Philippine Business Conference and Expo, these resolutions are addressed to two sets of audiences: the outgoing government administration and aspiring new leaders of the country. But in the interest of time, the PCCI will be more than happy to provide you with a list of our resolutions, which we have presented to the President. This set of resolutions, we believe, once addressed, will contribute to the building of a resilient Philippines. Thank you. Magandang hapon or good evening, and wishing you all a blessed Christmas.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bing Lemhoko, Chairman of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We have covered such a very impressive lineup of topic, and we've heard a lot from our distinguished panel of reactors that unfortunately we do not have enough time for our open forum, but we are still going to accept your questions, comments, as we are planning to continue the engagement way before after this particular forum. So to provide us with a synthesis, let me call now the president of our co-organizer, the National Resilience Council, Ms. Antonia Yulo Loizaga.
Yes, I have the unenviable task of synthesizing all these wonderful presentations. As substantive as they are, I've been given, if you believe, a 5 to 7 minute time frame within which to synthesize everyone's presentations. Let me just start where we all began, which is the concept of disaster risk governance and the role of the private sector in the changing risk environment in light of climate change and in light of the pandemic. Disaster risk governance is defined within the UN system variously as the system of institutions, mechanisms, policy and legal frameworks, and other arrangements that guide, coordinate, oversee disaster risk reduction and related policy areas. And here we look at, in fact, community level, national level, regional level, management and reduction of disaster and climate-related risks. What is the role of the private sector in disaster risk governance, given the challenges posed by the hazards that can compound and cascade, as they have done now in the period wherein we're experiencing climate change impacts and biological hazards such as COVID-19. There is also a potential for natural technological hazards wherein a natural hazard impacts technological systems. And this has happened to us in the case of businesses that are engaged in utilities. And we recognize that the risks are systemic, they are dynamic, and they are complex. So that systemic aspect, which really implies interconnections, intersections of exposure and vulnerability, are what we are having to deal with now, including the external challenges of the political transitions that we are about to experience. So how can we now ensure that the private sector can continue to provide the support that the national government and whole of society needs in order to continue the road towards disaster resilience? We heard first from the government, and as Mr. Pascual has actually stated, we are quite confident that the national government is trying to keep pace with these dynamic changes through policy frameworks, plans, programs, funding resources. And in fact, it has already put in place anticipatory plans and programs in order for us to continue to realize what it is that will be needed for risk governance in the coming years ahead, especially for the climate risks that we are facing in terms of the changes in means as well as the changes in extremes. There are challenges, though, that Yusek Halad and Asek Manila has actually put into their presentation. And we wanted to actually bring this up in terms of summing that up. Local implementation is a challenge. And the local implementation is really still led by a response framework. So what we are seeing is that the release of funding, the release of resources is still triggered by an actual event rather than a prevention of that event from happening. Except for the People's Survival Fund, wherein this is anticipatory. This in fact looks at long-term changes and challenges due to climate change. And in fact, that is in fact a bright light in terms of the national government's approach towards disaster resilience. Data governance policy and capacity need to be integrated and coordinated in order to achieve what we're calling strategic interoperability between the different national government agencies in terms of risk governance and downstream at the local level as well. Science and innovation and stakeholder collaboration are now possible due to the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Plan. The new plan, in fact, makes that possible. The entry of the private sector in terms of its own capacities, not just material, but also in terms of technology, innovation, and science. And I think one of the most significant contributions and developments here really are in two phases. The recognition that health service delivery infrastructure is critical in terms of determining future resilience for the country. There is also a recognition, in fact, that pre-disaster recovery is essential. And so the current effort with the World Bank on building back better is also one of the clear developments that are taking place that are new in terms of the strategy of the Philippine government towards resilience. ASEC Paula Alvarez talked a great deal and covered a great ground about sustainable financing and green financing. This has to do with climate action, both adaptation and mitigation in the short, medium, and long term, as well as disaster risk reduction in terms of the impact of sudden onset as well as slow onset disasters. The government is now strategically shifting and engaging the private sector through ESG, and it is now working together with all of us in terms of laying out what may be needed in light of the impact of the biological hazard that is COVID-19. ASEC Paula has made a very, very strong case about trying to build a climate resilient future using the Sustainable Finance Roadmap and guiding principles, 3 pillars of which are in policy, financing, and investment, and 7 principles actually on climate change adaptation and mitigation, transition to low carbon economy, food and water and energy security, sustainable cities, resilient infrastructure for inclusive growth, poverty reduction, and environmental management. The PSE, the BSP, and the DOF are all working together through their various mandates in order to make a green transition possible and a climate resilient future possible for the country. Dr. Aldaba has spoken very clearly about the state of the Philippine economy ravaged by both this pandemic, as well as, in fact, the possibility of more impacts from climate change. Both ASEC Paula and Dr. Aldaba mentioned that the daily cost of the quarantine measures that were put in place are in the trillions, and that would have implications in the decades to come. The economy has to be looked at, not just in terms of the growth, but broken down in terms of what he called the PITIC test, which I think is very applicable. Prices, jobs, income, presyo, trabajo, kita. Our economy is seen to be recovering, but it is a gradual recovery and it is a fragile recovery. There are risks ahead, economic risks that are global, as well as, of course, local. Health risks, such as the new variants that may actually come up, and a new pandemic that may actually happen. Political risks related to transition, to corruption, and of course, climate change and disaster risk reduction. The solutions lie in our development of the capital that we have, the human capital, and therefore health service is essential, education is essential, proactive, adaptive social protection that reduces vulnerability and therefore reduces risk. Science, technology, innovation, the role of HEIs, higher education institutions, and IT, digitalization for resilience, all of these will bring us closer to Industry 4.0, but this must be geared towards resilience and sustainability. Physical capital, modernization of agriculture, as well as our built systems and our built environment, as well as sustainable industrial policies also. Our government must heal and must unite in the future. We must strengthen local disaster risk governance, and social capital and trust networks are essential to this process. Corruption fighting as well is one of the key areas of this future work that is ahead of us. Mr. Hans-Peter Stouffer actually lay out very, very clearly a best practice in terms of multinational corporations such as UPS, which he belongs to. In fact, in terms of embodying and mainstreaming environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and governance into their ESG strategies for the future. And this include not just, of course, the environment, but also people that are to be taken care of by, say, access to vaccines, and in fact, inclusive and ethical practices in government, and disclosures that are voluntary, but now closer to becoming mandatory, such as the task force disclosures for climate-related financial disclosures. ARISE is actually part of the very great movement towards the private sector's involvement in disaster risk and reduction and resilience. The framing of national policies for all hazards, and including whole of society, are essential to moving forward in terms of the evolution from preparedness to response to DRRM and to finally to resilience. The post-pandemic new normal will have to be based, and it's biased, according to Mr. Topher, by attitude towards the virus. Are we going to live with it, or are we going to wish it away? However, as business, we need to ask the question, are we prepared, and what is needed? Finally, in terms of climate change, fundamental changes need to take place in the way we do business. And that has to do with all the processes that are involved in our enterprises. All hazards present impact our daily life now, and therefore we need to include this into considerations in decision-making. The private sector's role must be to cooperate and collaborate. And we are now unable to move forward unless that happens. ARISE in particular has 4 imperatives in terms of raising awareness, influencing, sharing knowledge, and catalyzing and implementing. It must work with SMEs to incorporate the DRR. Investors need to increase risk considerations in investment decisions. Insurers must do more than just prevention, to do more in prevention rather than managing income from premiums based, and must be in fact rewarding engagement in prevention and investment in prevention. And finally, working with governments on resilient infrastructure to support supply chains and what is needed in sustainable businesses. I will just go very briefly onto the reactors. And if that's possible, Wally, if you have still a few minutes, I'll mention some of the highlights from our reactors. I'd like to cite Dr. Pascual's area-based business continuity idea, which in fact is critical to understanding local risk, as well as addressing local risk and vulnerability, and supporting urbanization, as well as rural development. I would agree, and I would argue as well. So that nexus and that transition between rural and urban development will be well served by this new coordination framework from the local to the national, for local and national recovery between public and private sector. Area-based continuity management system would be essential for business to actually contribute to local development and continued growth. For Mr. Guerrero's reaction, I'd like to cite that in fact he is presenting the employer's perspective, and he mentioned that in fact 99.5% of our firms are in fact MSMEs, and they are covering 62.66% of the labor force. Digitalization has been necessary to keep businesses afloat, and so the change of the ways we work are also among the key areas of coordination and further adjustment in terms of our economy. The green shift has been mentioned, and they are doing this by building capacity to transition. ECOP is in fact also interested in supporting human resource and institutionalization of entrepreneurship and capacity building in BCPs, and addressing occupational health as well as mental health. And finally, the statement that everyone has a role to play in this road to resilience. Lastly, and a very comprehensive presentation by Ms. Bing Limhoko, I wanted to just highlight that in fact, there is a national employment recovery strategy, which also deals with the generation of 1 million new jobs in 2021 for economic recovery. They were behind the reopening of the economy, but also helping MSMEs do digital onboarding, which was critical to their resilience. There is a national roadmap for SME resilience, which involves the exchange of knowledge, tools, skills training, BCMS training, climate and disaster risk, insurance, financial literacy. They have supported the NDC statement of the Philippine government, and they are also well behind all the engagements that support the attainment of the SDGs. There is a short, medium, and long-term plan for continued economic recovery, and that has been submitted to the president, but is also going to be made part of the future leadership. I'll just close with a couple of statements, Wally, if I may, in terms of the overall impact of today's forum. I'd like to say that the private sector role in climate and disaster resilience in the next normal continues to evolve. Where the private sector was once viewed as a donor in response, it's now an active partner and in evidence-informed risk governance together with government and other sectors. Beyond advocacy, disaster risk reduction must be incorporated in all levels of decision-making in business, and this includes every member of the business enterprise, down to MSMEs, supply and value chains. The acceleration of digitalization that has been the result of COVID-19 is actually changing the way we work and the way we will be able to sustain ourselves financially in the future. Climate change changes everything. And it's not just a system or not just our businesses, but the communities that we serve and that we also rely on for our businesses that need to be protected from the impacts of climate change that may be compounded by biological hazards and technological ones as well. And so we need to think beyond the fence line and beyond our corporate boundaries and think of communities as we move forward. A deeper contextual understanding of the socioeconomic and environmental exposure and vulnerability to all hazards is needed. A systems lens must be adopted in order for the private sector to look beyond emissions reduction towards adaptation and disaster risk reduction, resilience today and in the future. The private sector can take a leading role in policy change, applying technology and innovation, financial capacities to changing the risk environment of this country. It can do this through continuous multi-stakeholder dialogue by embedding risk reduction resilience into core business value cycles, not just into CSR activities, and into evidence-informed ESG investments. And on that note, I will close my synthesis statement. Thank you very much, Wally.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tony Yulo Loizaga, the President of the National Resilience Council. Let me call back Vice Admiral Alex Pama to tell us about the next steps.
Thank you very much, Wally. And first and foremost, we'd like to apologize to everybody for us overshooting the time. But I guess it's well worth everybody's time. Well, thank you, Ms. Tony Loizaga, for that very comprehensive and accurate synthesis. Your abridged elucidation of the broad and complex issues and topics into clear and unmistakable language has indeed significantly aided our understanding of the imperatives we face, born out of the new realities we face in the future insofar as DRR and resilience is concerned, as it impacts on the private sector's activities. Indeed, we have a lot to consider and address if we have to succeed in our future advocacies and actions where the private sector would play pivotal roles. The culmination of today's forum is by no means an end to the narrative and efforts of how we will pursue the attainment of the objectives we have set forth in this forum. The significant points raised by our speakers in the presentations, as well as the rejoinders and supplements by the reactors that were succinctly laid out by Ms. Loizaga's synthesis, shall serve as our fundamental basis and reference to further develop and broaden our efforts to achieve an outcome embodied in this forum's theme. We will likewise provide you, our participants, with a link through an MS forms, which we hope you can spend time to share with us your comments and reactions to the presentations and commentaries from our speakers and pool of reactors. With all of this, we intend to generate a document that will consolidate all the relevant points that have been discussed and contributed. This document will then be shared with those interested to join in the conduct of subsequent other activities to fine-tune the conduct a document which we hope to publish sometime next year. Once again, thank you all for having seen the commitment you have shown today, coupled with the anticipated outcome of today's forum. We are confident that we have all the reasons to believe that we, in the private sector, shall be moving ahead with optimism and certainty to pursue our advocacies and efforts in DRR and resilience, in spite of the traditional and new challenges we face. To the top leaders who are with us today and all the participants, rest assured that this forum will continue to be the venue for the private sector in the Philippines in taking the lead in the advocacy and actions to ensure the effective role of the private sector in the continuity of effective disaster risk governance in collaboration with the government and other stakeholders. Before I turn over the floor to our Vice Chair for his closing remarks, allow me to express our thanks to all of you for your participation in our webinar today, most especially to our special guest speakers, discussants, as well as those of you who have participated, excuse me, through your posted questions and shared insights on the topics and issues discussed today. We also thank the prime mover of this group, Mr. Hans Sy, who has been with us the whole afternoon. And again, thank you to all of you for your participation. The Arise Philippines Secretariat team will be reaching out to you for your respective offices to pursue our next steps and ways ahead. Magandang hapon po o magandang gabi sa inyong lahat.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Alexander Pama, Co-Chair of Arise Philippines. And as he has mentioned, to bring our forum to a close, we would like to call the Vice Chair of Arise Philippines, Attorney Alex Cabrera, for his closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Wally. And I'd just like to reiterate on behalf of the Arise Board, I'd like to thank our speakers who unselfishly shared their time with us, our friends in government and the private sector and the academe. Special mention to Co-Chair Hans Peter of Arise Global, Miss Mami Mitsutori of the United Nations Office. And may I also make special mention of our local DRR champions, Mr. Hans Sy, Vice Admiral Alex Pama, and Mr. Tony Yulo Loizaga. In the pillars of disaster risk reduction, none is more inspiring and touching, if I may say, than rehabilitation and recovery. But among the same pillars, nothing saves lives more than prevention and mitigation. Financing is the lifeblood of disaster risk reduction management. Tireless advocacy is its soul, but only action brings DRR aspirations to life. One crucial act is the strengthening of our network led by Arise and like-minded organizations. And as individual organizations, we can still help and make a difference. But as a network, we can arrest or catch disaster risks like a strong net that catches falling performers. Our network of government agencies, both national and local, the academe, the private sector, the guidance of UN's governance framework can never be too strong. But the test of its strength would be in the way that it helps MSMEs and the rest of the value chain to embrace ESG and become disaster resilient. The pandemic brought us to our knees, but God willing, vaccinations and cure will become reliable and widely available. But for the continuing threat of disasters, there is no pill. For discontinued business, loss of jobs, and loss of income because of flooding, storms, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, there is no serum. And for the tragedies, the homelessness, and the hunger after a calamity, there is no antibiotic. There is only sacrifice. Our network and we only have each other to make our hopes audacious and to make the best version of ourselves arise in the most difficult of times. Thank you, everyone, and have a very good evening.
Thank you very much, Attorney Alex Cabrera. And with that, we formally call to a close the 2021 Top Leaders Forum. And we hope that all of you will continue the engagement, continue our partnerships and collaborations moving forward to ensure continuity of private sector engagement for effective risk governance, given our new risks due to the pandemic, climate change, and our economic outlook. We hope to see all of you again in the 2023 Top Leaders Forum next year. Mabuhay po tayong lahat.